If det inte arbetas för det bara den starving wording would caters the kunde att bli kritik in the jigen. Kriti betiva de kan the gadded the going to carry to the passmanship of going gunby kan the gadded steed. Grotigan railed pals quints were about man the curdy gather bop out that scotch what they got beds to stare that bunnigan rallying cam that is something so breathtakingly be bustakenly be calf. With bite but the viga bikes culp? Now, before we even get into the work itself, let us spend a little time talking about what this truck is, where it comes from, and why it matters so much to so many people. Because context is everything when it comes to classic vehicles, and understanding what you are looking at makes the restoration mean so much more. The truck you are seeing here is a 1957 Chevrolet Task Force Series pickup truck. And the Task Force generation, which ran from 1955 through 1955, crop, represents what many automotive historians, collectors, and enthusiasts consider to be the absolute pinnacle of American pickup truck design. The moment when form and function came together in the most perfect way, when the designers at General Motors created something that was not just a capable workhorse, but was genuinely undeniably beautiful in a way that very few commercial vehicles have ever been before or since. The year 1957 specifically holds an almost mythological place in American automotive code of culture. It was the year of the iconic 1957 Chevy Bel Air, perhaps the most recognized and beloved American car of the entire post-war era, and that same design language, that same spirit of optimism and progress and bold mid-century modernism, flowed directly into the Task Force pickup trucks of that same era, giving them those gorgeous flowing fender lines, that wide panoramic windshield, those distinctive hood contours, and that proud upright cab silhouette that just almost have been proof upon E6 kitty ass. Where's Ladderwood? It is at wits ned dot of but a badge. Think about what America was like in 1947 even. The country there wove the rotting, the crestum terrassumly gathered a marrow and striva morable the running. In human history, the suburbs were expanding, families were moving into new homes, the highway system was being built, the future felt bright and limitless, and every product that came out of American factories in that era seemed to reflect that confidence, that optimism, that sense that America could make anything it set its mind to and make it beautifully. And the Task Force Chevy trucks embodied all of that perfectly. They were trucks that a man could be palladian steel without sacrosanct and drive to no beket, beetle kata, bestel citadel that's a tasab of its mouth, and a chkev of a padet that. So when a truck like this comes into the shop in the condition this one was in, and we will get to just how bad that condition was in a moment, it carries all of that history with it, all of that cultural weight, all of that's decades of American stories and American work and American life. And the responsibility of a restoration like this is not just mechanical or cosmetic. It is almost historical in nature. It is about preserving and honoring something that represents a very specific and very important moment in American culture. And that is a responsibility we take extremely seriously. Now, let us talk about the condition of this truck when it arrived, because honestly, the before state of this vehicle was pretty sobering even by the standards of what we see come through these doors on a regular basis. This truck had been sitting outdoors in the elements, we believe in a field, based on the vegetation damage we found in various places, for somewhere between 25 and 35 years, possibly longer, and that kind of long-term outdoor abandonment does things to a vehicle that are genuinely difficult to fully comprehend until you see it up close and start pulling things apart. The exterior was covered in a thick layer of oxidized, chalky remnants of what had once been paint, but calling it paint at that point would be generous. It was more like a residue, a memory of paint, clinging in patches to steel that had been working very hard for decades to return itself to iron oxide, which of course is the natural thermodynamic destiny of all unprotected steel. The iron just wants to go back to being ore, and given enough time and moisture, it will always win that battle. The rust on this truck was not superficial surface rust, the kind that you see on a daily driver that lives in the snow belt and gets salt on it every winter. This was deep, structural, pervasive corrosion that had worked its way through the metal in numerous locations and left holes you could put your hand through in some places. The floor pans were completely gone, both driver and passenger side eaten through so thoroughly that if you sat in the truck and looked down, you could see the ground right through what remained of the sheet metal, which was essentially nothing more than a lacy network of rust held together by habit and wishful thinking. The rocker panels on both sides had similar issues. The cab corners were compromised, there were holes in the bed floor that you could see daylight through, and there was significant surface rust on virtually every metal surface throughout the entire vehicle. The engine. A genuine original small block V8, which was tremendously exciting to find when we confirmed it, because these trucks can be repowered with newer engines over the decades, and finding an original numbers-matching powertrain is always a cause for celebration. The engine was completely seized, had not turned over in probably 3 decades or more. The oil inside had turned into a thick block sludge that had essentially cemented the internals in place. And there was water intrusion through the intake that had stake that had essentially cemented the internals in place. And there was water intrusion through the intake that had essentially cemented the internals in. The transmission was similarly frozen, the rear end was locked up, the brakes were completely non-functional with all the whistle cylinders seized, and the brake lines rotted through, and virtually every rubber component on the entire vehicle, every bushing, every shing, every seal, every hose, every gasket had either completely deteriorated or was so far gone as to be non-functional. The glass was a disaster. The windshield had a massive crack running across nearly the entire width of it. The rear window had a chunk missing from the lower corner, and the door glass on the driver's side was shattered and held in place by nothing more than the remnants of the window rubber. The interior was what you would expect after 30-plus years of weather exposure with no protection. The seat springs were exposed, the foam was gone, the vinyl was cracked and peeling and mold-covered. The door panels had delaminated and warped. The headliner had collapsed entirely, and the carpet was a matted, rotted mess that had fused itself to the floor pan in the places where the floor pan still existed. Even the steering wheel, that beautiful period-correct 2-spoke wheel, was cracked and discolored. The chrome horn ring was pitted and flaking, and the dash was faded to a uniform grayish-brown that gave no hint of what its original color might have been. And yet, standing back and looking at this truck even in that terrible state, you could still see it. You could see the bones, the lines, the proportions. You could see exactly what this truck had been and what it could be again. And that is the thing about a great design. It transcends the damage, it endures through the neglect, it waits patiently for someone who sees it, and we saw it immediately. We knew from the first moment we walked around this truck that we were going to bring it back, and bring it back properly. The planning phase of a restoration like this is something that a lot of people overlook or underestimate, but it is absolutely critical to a successful outcome. Because a project of this scope and complexity has hundreds of moving parts, literally and figuratively, and without a clear plan and a clear vision, you end up making decisions on the fly that can compromise the overall result. You end up with a truck that looks sort of okay in some areas, and not quite right in others, because there was no coherent vision guiding every choice along the way. Our vision for this truck was clear from the beginning. We wanted a show-quality, ground-up restoration that would be absolutely correct to the period in terms of style, proportions, and aesthetic, while incorporating carefully chosen, tastefully hidden modern upgrades in the areas of safety, reliability, and usability. Because a truck this beautiful deserves to actually be driven and enjoyed, not just trailered to shows and kept behind velvet rope. And the modern upgrades we planned, improved braking, modern electrical, updated cooling, would all be invisible from the outside while making the truck dramatically safer and more reliable as a driver. The color choice was something we spent real time on, because on a truck like this, the color is not just a color, it is a statement. It defines the entire personality of the vehicle and either honors or undermines the design depending on how well chosen it is. We looked at period-correct Chevrolet color ops from a 1955 My5ins, and there were one for apparency with therein. Inturamida Bradseconds assembly retunib, a rhyme terrid wonder apparaturing. Tramite by the scene sat in one. It remededibers. But we kept coming back to turquoise baton combinations, specifically that rich, vibrant, optimistic turquoise that is so completely and perfectly of its era, so absolutely right for a 1950s turquoise, that every time we looked at its revisionist turquoise task force truck, something just clicked. Something felt completely inevitable, and once we made that decision, we never looked back. Because as we hoped, they tonsed by it. It is what cabin of that the might get a bit. The teardown began on a Monday morning and took the better part of 2 full weeks to murmuring. And the quartables in the app. It's refonsia romp summerby. Irresigavrabardie versamativary to say. It is a methodical, documented, organized process of disassembly that preserves as much information as possible about how the vehicle was originally assembled, where every bolt and bracket and clip goes, what the original finishes were in various locations, what the original wiring looked like before it was disturbed. All of this information is critically important when it comes time to reassemble, and a restaurant that with good documentation and what it may cons, out a reassembled it with good documentation at what it cons, at a what is money. Every nut and bolt that came off this truck was either cleaned, inspected, measured, and retained if it was in good condition, or cataloged as needing replacement if it was too far gone. And the parts that were retained were organized into labeled bins that made the reassembly process dramatically more straightforward than it would otherwise have been. The cab came off the frame first, lifted carefully with the shop crane and set on a dedicated body stand that allowed us to work on it from every angle, and once the cab was off the frame, the transformation was dramatic. Suddenly, instead of a complete vehicle, you had 2 separate things, a bare steel ladder frame sitting on the shop floor and a cab up on the stand, and both of them needed enormous amounts of work. The bed came off next, removed completely and disassembled into its component parts. The bed sides, the tailgate, the front panel, the bed floorboards, all came apart and were individually assessed and tagged. And the bedwood, those gorgeous period-correct hardwood bed slats, were of course completely rotted and would need to be replaced entirely with new reproduction slats, which is something we always plan for on a truck that has been sitting outdoors for this long. Because wood and moisture over decades is an equation that only ever has one answer. Frame restoration is something that does not always get the attention it deserves in restoration coverage. Probably because frames are not glamorous. They are not shiny. They are not what people take photos of and post on the internet. But the frame is the literal foundation of the entire vehicle, and if it is not done right, nothing else matters. So we spent considerable time on this frame, making sure it was done absolutely correctly. After media blasting, we did a thorough inspection of every inch of the frame, including all the welds, checking for any signs of cracking or stress fractures, particularly around the spring perches and cross-member attachment points. And we were genuinely pleased to find that this frame was structurally solid throughout, with no repairs needed beyond cleaning up some surface pitting and a few areas of light corrosion. The frame was then coated in a proper chassis paint, a semi-gloss black that looks period correct and provides excellent long-term protection. And all of the mounting points for the body, bed, cab, and suspension were cleaned, chased with the proper tabs, and treated so that everything would go back together cleanly and correctly. With the frame done, we turned our full attention to the cab and the metalwork, and this is where the project really got into the most challenging and time-consuming territory. Because the metal repairs on this truck were extensive and they required a level of skill and patience that genuinely separates the craftsman from the people who just call themselves craftsmen. Our lead metal fabricator, who has been doing this work for over 25 years, approached the cab methodically, starting with a thorough assessment of every panel and every structural component and creating a priority list that addressed the most critical structural issues first before moving on to the cosmetic repairs. The floor pans were the first and most significant item on that list, and we chose to replace both floor pans completely rather than attempt to patch them, because in a case where the rust damage is as extensive as it was here, patching never gives you the same structural integrity or the same long-term durability as a proper full replacement. And when you are going to the trouble and expense of a ground-up restoration like this one, there is simply no logical reason to cut corners on the foundation. The reproduction floor pans for the 1955 to 1959 Task Force trucks are thankfully available from good quality suppliers, and after some fitting and trimming to get them to sit exactly right in the cab, they were welded in using a combination of plug welds through the flanges and continuous mi-jam welds through the flanges and continuous mi-jam welds along the seams. And every weld was then ground smooth and finished so that when the cab is completed, you would never know the floors had been replaced. It looks and feels completely factory, which is exactly the standard we hold ourselves on every restoration. The cab corners were next, and the driver's side rear cab corner was particularly bad, with a hole nearly 6 inches across where the rust had eaten completely through the lower corner where the cab meets the bed. And this area is notoriously prone to rust on these trucks because it is a spot where dirt and moisture tend to collect and sit against the metal for extended periods, accelerating the corrosion process. Our fabricator made the patch panel for this area by hand, shaping it over the English wheel to get exactly the right compound curves to match the original contour of the cab corner, and fitting it so precisely that again, when it was welded and finished, you could not detect the repair. The lines flowed perfectly, the surface was straight, the corner had that characteristic gentle curve that defines the Task Force body shape. The rocker panels on both sides were replaced with reproduction rockers that slipped into place with only minor fitting required. And the various smaller rust-through areas on the bedsides, the lower doors, and the tailgate were addressed with hand-fabricated patch panels that were welded in and finished to the same invisible standard as all the other repairs. The door skins on both doors had some surface rust and minor damage, but the door shells themselves were structurally sound, so we chose to keep the original doors and address the surface issues during the body prep phase rather than replacing the skins. And this actually worked out well because original door shells on these trucks have better fit than some of the reproduction panels available. And a good fit at the door gaps is one of the most visible quality indicators on any restored vehicle. Once all the metalwork was complete and signed off, the entire cab went through a thorough inspection process where we went over every repair one more time under very strong lighting, checking for any areas that needed additional attention, any high or low spots that the primer would reveal, any areas where the metal transition between repair panel and original panel was not perfectly smooth, and a few small areas were addressed during this inspection before we moved on to primer. The primer process on a restoration like this is multi-stage and critically important, and it starts with epoxy primer applied directly to the bare metal immediately after the metalwork is finalized, because bare metal begins to flash rust within hours in a humid environment, and getting that first coat of epoxy on protects the metal and provides the adhesion foundation for everything that follows. We used a high-quality 2-component epoxy primer for this initial coat, applying it over every bare metal surface inside and outside the cab. And once it had cured properly, we applied a high-build polyester primer surfacer, which is the material that does the heavy lifting in terms of filling the minor surface imperfections that are present in any metal surface, the small scratches from the media blasting, the tiny pinholes, the slight waviness in repaired areas, and building up a surface that can be block sand to perfect flatness. The block sanding process on this cab took several full days of work spread over about 2 weeks, because we applied the primer surfacer in multiple heavy coats, allowing each coat to fully cure before sanding, and the sanding itself was done by hand with long boards and firm backing pads that keep the sandpaper working the high spots rather than flexing into the low spots, which is the key to getting a truly flat surface. We used guide coat, a contrasting spray of a different color applied lightly over the primer, to help visualize the sanding progress, because the guide coat sits in the low spots and gets sanded off the high spots, giving you an immediate visual map of where the surface is still uneven. And we kept sanding and repriming and sanding again until the guide coat was coming off completely evenly across every panel with no low spots remaining, which is the standard for show quality bodywork. Simultaneously with the body prep work, the mechanical restoration was proceeding on the frame and drivetrain side of the shop. And the engine work deserves particular attention, because this engine is one of the central characters of this truck's story, both historically and practically. The small block Chevrolet V8 that came out of this truck is a genuine period-correct engine, and even in its seized, water-damaged, 3 decades of neglect condition, our engine builder could see that the fundamental architecture was sound and that a proper rebuild was both possible and absolutely worth doing, rather than simply replacing it with a newer crate engine. The engine was completely disassembled down to the bare block, every component removed, cleaned, inspected, and measured, and the results of that inspection determined the scope of the rebuild. The block itself was in remarkably good condition structurally, no cracks, no warping, no serious damage to the main bearing saddles, though the cylinder bores showed the expected wear along with some light pitting on a few cylinders from the water intrusion. So the block was sent to the machine shop for boring, which means removing a few thousandths of an inch of material from each cylinder bore, which means removing a few thousandths of an inch of material from each cylinder bores back to a perfectly round, smooth, consistent diameter, after which oversized pistons are used to maintain the proper clearance between piston and bore. The cylinder heads were similarly sent for complete rebuilding. New valve seats were cut, new valves were installed, the combustion chambers were cleaned and measured for volume consistency, and every surface that needed to be flat was checked and resurfaced on the milling machine to ensure perfect gasket sealing. The rotating assembly, crankshaft, connecting rods, pistons, was all carefully inspected and measured. The crankshaft journals were found to be within serviceable limits with just light polishing needed, and all new connecting rod bearings and main bearings were measured and fitted to ensure correct oil clearances throughout. New pistons, rings, pins, and wrist-pinned bushings were installed. The timing set was replaced with a new heavy-duty double-roller chain set for improved durability. The camshaft was replaced with a period-correct performance grind that gives this engine a slightly more aggressive idle quality while keeping it completely streetable and reliable. And the valve train, all the lifters, push rods, and rocker arms was all new. The oil pump was replaced with a high-volume unit, the water pump was replaced, the fuel pump was rebuilt, and the carburetor, a correct period-style 2-barrel unit, was completely disassembled, cleaned ultrasonically, rebuilt with all new internal components, and set up on the bench before installation. The ignition system was upgraded to a modern electronic ignition hidden inside a period-correct-looking distributor, which gives you the reliability and precision of modern electronic ignition with the appearance of a factory-correct points distributor. And this is one of those hidden upgrades that dramatically improves the drivability and reliability of the truck without changing anything about its authentic appearance. The engine assembly process is where all that precise machining and measurement pays off, because when everything is assembled with correct clearances and proper torque specifications, the engine has a precision and a solidity to it that you can feel as you hand turn it before firing it for the first time, and there is a very specific satisfaction in rotating a freshly rebuilt engine by hand and feeling the smooth, consistent compression on each cylinder and knowing that everything inside is working together correctly. After assembly, the engine was started on a break-in stand before installation in the truck, running through the critical cam break-in procedure and giving us the opportunity to check for any leaks or issues before the engine was in the vehicle, and it fired up on the second crank and settled into a smooth, confident idle. that had the whole shop gathered around smiling, because the first start on a freshly rebuilt engine is always a special moment. The transmission, a correct period 3-speed manual unit, was completely rebuilt similarly to the engine, with all new synchronizers, new bearings, new seals, the shift forks inspected and replaced where worn, and the shift mechanism adjusted to give that crisp, positive feel that a well-rebuilt manual transmission should have. The rear axle was gone through with new bearings, new seals, and the differential was inspected and set up with the correct backlash and bearing preload, and the drive shaft was balanced after installation to eliminate any vibration at highway speeds. The braking system on this truck was one of the Durabirki Werberkare a Korporaber Amon. Regani Forbidi Carpediravingermeter Korvarum trim drums to disc brakes using a bolt-on conversion kit designed specifically for this application. And the reasons for doing so are entirely safety-related. Disc brakes provide dramatically better stopping power. They fade far less under repeated hard use quirks. Provide dramatically better stopping power. They fade far less under repeated hard use. They self-adjust automatically so the brake they were stopping power. They carby freaking a turfing candala brakes and to pract conditions where the car-free cars around you up brakes as not a brakes and the disc 3 were 8. The front disc conversion looks completely stock from outside the vehicle. The factory-style steel wheels and the classic hubcaps hide everything. And from the driver's seat, the pedal feel is perfectly modern, firm, and progressive, and confidence-inspiring in a way that original drum brakes simply never were. The rear drums were rebuilt with all new shoes, new wheel cylinders, new hardware, and the rear brake adjusters were freed up and properly set, and the entire brake hydraulic system was flushed and refilled with fresh fluid, and all the brake lines were replaced with new stainless steel braided lines throughout. The Sisimpan Riedel of the Dekerpelid, we quarrable termined, incurably guetter. In enchiminar corpolicor it's, I meet the rebbething irverbit simming. Bitten can make rebeefing up frumple, emit trumble at some bitters that a bit trend, the grubla cup by approximately 2 inches using a drop spindle kit that is specifically designed for this application, and the reason this modification works so well on these trucks is that the slightly DON for this application. And the reason this modification works so well on these trucks is that the slightly lower front end brings the fender lines into a proportion relationship with the wheels and tires that actually looks more period correct than the original ride height, because when the trups step they be ben more bedding. It did not day where it might it. New front ball joints, new tie rod ends, new idler arm, new drag link, all new rubber bushings throughout the front suspension. The steering box rebuilt with a new sector shaft seal and adjusted for proper tight center feel. New front coil springs matched to the vehicle weight, and quality shock absorbers front and rear selected for the right balance of ride quality and handling control for a truck of this weight in intended use. The cooling system was completely replaced. New radiator with increased capacity compared to the original to handle the slightly warmer operating conditions of modern traffic, new water pump, new hoses throughout, new thermostat, and the cooling system was pressure tested before the engine was started in the vehicle to confirm there were no leaks anywhere in the system. The fuel system was completely new from the tank to the carburetor, new gas tank with new sending unit, new fuel lines in stainless steel, new fuel filter, and the tank was treated internally with a sealer specifically designed for vintage fuel tanks to prevent future rust contamination of the fuel. Now, as the mechanical work was being finished up and the body was completing its final stages of paint preparation, the two sides of the project were converging toward that glorious moment when a freshly painted, show-quality body gets reunited with a completely rebuilt, perfectly sorted mechanical package. But before we could get there, we needed to address the paint itself. And the painting of this truck was something we prepared for extensively and approached with the same level of care and attention that we brought to every other phase of the project. The paint booth was cleaned thoroughly before we brought the cab and body panels in, because dust and contamination in the booth during painting is one of the most common causes of paint defects that require extensive correction work after the fact. And while some level of post-paint polishing is always part of our process, minimizing the contamination that you are trying to polish out starts with booth cleanliness. The panels were all tack wiped and blown off with filtered compressed air immediately before shooting primer sealer, which is the final coat of primer that goes on before the color and serves to both lock in all the prep work and provide a uniform base for the color to go over. And the sealer choice matters because different sealers can affect the way the color lays and the way the final gloss develops. So we carefully matched our sealer to our color and top coat system. The color, that gorgeous, rich, period perfect turquoise, was mixed to a custom match of an original Chevrolet color from the era, and the mixing process itself requires considerable skill and a well-calibrated eye, because the target color has to be exactly right and then it has to be adjusted for the particular batch of pigments being used that day and the specific conditions in the booth. And our painter has been mixing custom colors for over 2 decades, and his eye for color is genuinely exceptional. For over 2 decades, and his eye for color is genuinely exceptional. The color was applied in 3 coats, starting with a lighter foundation coat to establish the base coverage and then building up the color depth, with subsequent medium wet coats that gave the paint its full richness and depth. And the flash time between coats was carefully monitored using both timer and solvent pop testing to ensure that each coat was flashed to exactly the right point before the next coat was applied, because rushing the flash time is one of the most common causes of solvent pop and other film defects that ruin an otherwise perfect paint job. The clear coat, a high solid, high gloss 2-component urethane clear, was applied in 4 coats over the cured color, and the clear is where the depth and the gloss of the finish really comes together, where all the work you have put into preparation and color application is either rewarded or punished depending on how well it was done. And in this case, the rewarded or punished depending on how well it was done. And in this case, the reward was exceptional, because the paint came out of the booth looking wet and deep and flawless in a way that immediately told everyone in the shop that something special was happening here. After the clear had cured for several days under controlled temperature conditions, the paint correction process began. And paint correction on a show-quality restoration is a multi-stage process that involves wet sanding the clear coat with progressively finer grits of sandpaper to level the surface completely, removing any texture, any orange peel, any dust nibs or other imperfections that are present even in the best fresh paint, and then polishing through progressively finer stages of machine polishing compound until the surface has that mirror-like glass smooth finish where you can read the reflection of a text message on your phone, just as theirs has that mirror-like glass smooth finish where you can read the text message on your phone. The chrome was another major component of the restoration that required extensive work and significant investment, because the chrome on a 1950s Chevy truck is not incidental decoration. It is a fundamental part of the design. It is what gives these trucks their sparkle and their sense of occasion and their connection to that era of American optimism and abundance when chrome was everywhere, because it communicated quality and modernity and success. Every piece of cobble, their cubby tubble, their recover editive, working the right of a bowl. At within blurby that vol itam, tridiming. We the thing ever one off rent, drink of the dayam, rismudkim. Tidithamora blikaran, thriditrintens borum. The windshield trimmer arms, the windshield trimborum arbolatings, the various body side trim pieces went to our chrome plating shop, and the process of restoring chrome probably is not quick or cheap, because each piece first has to be stripped of all the old chrome and nickel plating, then any pitting or damage in a base metal, as to be filled in chrome plating. Bit chrome bread, a virchem cobrevits, and for temp the cum the peating grease the dentificus the raup, the fident the bitter what it dan that give. The results of proper triple plated chrome work are absolutely stunning. Each piece came back from the plater looking like liquid silver with a depth and brilliance and perfection that you simply cannot achieve any other way. Not with polished aluminum, not with chrome spray paint, not with any substitute. Real chrome has a quality to it that is immediately recognizable and that elevates everything around it. And seeing all these freshly plated pieces laid out on the assembly bench before they went on the truck was genuinely thrilling. The glass was all replaced with new production glass, sourced from a supplier who specializes in vintage Chevrolet glass, and the new windshield, rear window, and door glass all fit the openings properly without requiring any of the persuasion and shimming that sometimes accompanies reproduction glass of lesser quality. And all the new glass was installed with new weather stripping that seals properly and has that satisfying, solid, close quality feel when you shut a door that tells you the gaps and the sealing are right. The interior build-out was one of the most enjoyable phases of the entire project, because by the time we got to the interior, the truck was already mechanically complete and painted. And every piece of interior work was additive. You were covering up the bare metal, adding color and texture and comfort and personality, building up the finished picture piece by piece. And this truck's interior came together in a way that exceeded even our already high expectations. The foundation of the interior is the upholstery, and we worked with a talented upholstery shop that specializes in vintage vehicle interiors to design a package that was completely correct the period in terms of style and material choices while being executed to a modern quality standard. And the design we landed on was a two-tone scheme in turquoise and white that directly echoes the exterior color, using a period-correct vinyl that has the right texture and sheen for the era, with rolled and pleated seat panels that are one of the signature design elements of 1950s American vehicle interiors. The seat rebuild started with the springs. The original spring assembly was cleaned, retied, and padded where necessary to provide a firm but comfortable foundation, because you want the original character of the seat preserved rather than replacing everything with modern foam that sits and feels completely different. And then layers of padding and the final vinyl cover were built up over the spring foundation in a process that requires skill and patience to get right, because the cover has to be pulled with exactly the right tension to get those pleats to lay straight and uniform and the vinyl to leave without wrinkles or bubbles anywhere. The door panels were custom fabricated from a base of hardboard covered in foam and then wrapped in matching vinyl, with bright aluminum trim accents that referenced the type of bright work that was popular in 1950s interiors. And the door panels were fitted to the doors very carefully to ensure they sat flat against the door skin and that the gap around the edges was consistent and correct. The hebbedoorbrige bubbers yard beater of water, a fappeliather equiligible paradiship. Ira krima for another canal of the arbors and me braided bokema some thread of thanathur big up some minute of the visitor hound biberian so but can it bread him a jewer dig barracan with some ravewits. The head decorates. The headliner within recorder reportable sanswer is a mabawet shimlajish. The headliner is one of brokenness ballner of shimis. The head at flawns. For tomato wibbits. Repaintish can play the smooth and wink the canaric. Witten tech colt bracked blow it's precared. With the complete tape roads garable it's sonded smooth where the 8-brit of Bielbis kennet. At level at a beverage column, it's a bit dead gaps. With 8, which at the wadata, a bit up the back of the bit. All the controls, the ignition switch, the headlight knob, the wiper switch, the choke, the heater controls, were all cleaned or replaced as needed and reinstalled in their correct locations, and the steering wheel was professionally restored with a new covering applied over the original rim and the chrome horn ring replated to match the rest of the chrome on the truck, and the restored steering wheel installed in the truck looks absolutely factory original. The work cover pickles of working bull over a breath thank it to merge sitter retherful at table wood and where they cater for that for a bit at send him to reverence the feminine ubiquitous ready to a bit of fit for apes ding with big booty comes to rat but I mean for dickon is a brute second mark and a right fit right up a that's good at police's boot freds and marcation super looper to tree then it takes if it is modded even would a web this which should be prepared a bit and if it equals oaken but you keep out did with because and bobbit chiv liquid cut Raven buns and age of a go bits. Red a tickle the bit of the bird. Ship a bit of wickets of blitted your dent. Red a bitter that whip be with the dirt. It is the pepper of a bit of it. The wheel and tire package on this truck is absolutely perfect for the era and the aesthetic. A set of 15-inch steel wheels finished in bright white and fitted with reproduction dog dish hubcaps that flash brilliantly in the sunlight with a set of wide white wall tires that have exactly the right proportions for these trucks. Wide enough to fill the fender openings properly but not so wide that they look anachronistic, and the combination of white wheels with white sidewalls against that turquoise paint with all that chrome is simply visually perfect in the way that very few things in the automotive world ever managed to be. The final assembly of this truck, the moment when all the separately of twoing with a beer twirrier they can fleam with the frebeliers of the everless. About a week equests over the course of about a week, and it was a week of pure joy because every component that went on was perfect. Every bolt torqued to spec, every gap set correctly, every piece of trim snapped or screwed into its proper location, and as the truck came together piece by piece you could feel the excitement in the shop building. Because everyone who worked on this project could see that it was coming out beautifully, a better than any of us had becanned when we were looking at that rusted, seized beaten down old truck, and askek I get a bit speed with it million. She partake it of her chaker berdika beritave make a brick, and make of a regular caber riddy beeper recay picket pepper polum for each shamble wees with thankin of the breath. The bay the merchants corn the dick at the burble to do brit at the end. Would it give is that a beach con the queers, but at a bit out that and bit of agreed do it a bit made it to Jones, which have a preempted and bit to thank good ability and split bitchin. With it at the ball and the went to be the pedant, bid did bri bit eth, it a bit of tooth fakely, dimmer to bit to fit him week for brout, a dope bit good to be fitted of its bait red. If bacon the but a chicken to be cow. Thank you for watching this complete restoration journey with us from beginning to end. If you love classic trucks, if you love the craft of restoration, if you believe that these incredible pieces of American automotive history deserve to be preserved and celebrated and driven, then you understand exactly what we were trying to do here and why. And we hope that seeing this 1957 Chevy Task Force pickup truck brought back to life has given you as much joy watching it as it gave us doing it.